right. How's everybody this morning? Everybody doing all right? Welcome. Can we thank our band again? How about our band this morning? Doing great. Love the singing. Some of y'all sound really good out there too. Hey, take your notes out. We're going to start a new series. We're calling the series Do the Math. Say it with me. Do the math. Now, before we do this, I want to lift up a couple things. I want to make sure we all know. First of all, I'm going to do a little thing here because I am aware that we got somebody here today who just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Jack and Wendy Ulrich, there they are right there. Would you stand? He's going to be mad. There we are. 50 years. Come on. August 3rd, I was telling Jack earlier, he said, listen, if you got marriage struggles, you want to talk to him after, he normally charges $50. Today, $25 only, okay? So you want to check with him, he can talk to you about that. So I'm excited about that. The other thing I want to do, you heard Beth mention earlier, today is Promotion Sunday. So all of our kids in our kids ministry go up a grade today, and that's an exciting thing. So if you're here today as a parent, you need to ask them about it afterwards. Let them take a moment and celebrate that moment. We do really good work. We do good work in here, but we do good work on the other side of these walls over here too. And so just be sure to ask your kids about that. And we always take an opportunity to just celebrate that moment. So when you leave here today, we're about to start school. How many can believe that? We're about to start school. I was talking to a parent. I said, I cannot believe school's almost here. And he goes, I can believe school's almost here. I was like, I'm not touching that. Okay. But we got a picture spot out there, out on the porch. And so you might want to get your family all together and take a picture and document the moment. But we also always take an opportunity to thank those. You think about this, like the kids come home for a summer. And then for the rest of the year, they're with teachers and with administrators and educators and all that, and we want to honor them. So if you're working in private school, public school, homeschool, whatever you're doing this morning, would you stand and can we honor these folks who are doing good work? There they are. That's great. Come on. Heroes among us right in the room. That's great. I always think about this. At this time of the year, I remember when I was in school. How many of y'all can remember back that far? Some of you are raising your hands. You're not even telling the truth. You can't remember. But you're here. And I was thinking about this week. In fact, I was talking to my mom about it, that when I was growing up, I'm the middle of three sons, we had some rituals that my parents would engage in every year. And I don't know if you guys do that, but these are some of the rituals. We would, my folks would take us to get new clothes, and we would go to the department store. Some of you, right? Department store to get clothes. And I remember back in the day when I was growing up in school and going to school, like Levi's corduroy pants were the thing. How many of you remember that? And I had some of those in every color. And then I don't know what happened. One year I didn't get Levi's. They took me to JCPenney and I got plain pockets. How many of y'all remember those? I was like, did Dad get like a cut and pay or like what happened with that? And I remember that. And then we would go and we made this moment, we would go get our school supplies. How many of y'all remember that moment? That was a cool moment. And you remember, how many of y'all remember we used to get like a pencil box? Remember the pencil box? And like if you were really cool, you'd get a cigar box. Right? I remember I had a friend of mine who had a cigar box. And then we would pick out crayons. Am I the only one who remembers this stuff? Come on, just humor me for just a moment, all right? I'm in my jam here. And we would get all these school supplies and we would do all this. And then my mom would take us, listen to this, we'd go to Woolworths. My people. We would go to Woolworths, and my mom would say, you can pick out your lunch box. And there were those metal lunch boxes that had a little thermos in there. How many remember that? That was so cool. And we would walk, I still remember this, we'd walk into Woolworths, like all three of us, we'd traipse in there, and they'd have this all in front of us. And it was like, oh, and you would just feel the love to like pick out your thing. I just remember that. And my mom and my dad, they had this song that they would sing to us on the first day of school every year. And I was asking her about this week because I said, I can't believe I'm even asking you because you drilled it into my head every year. But there was a song, and I'm going to sing it. My voice is not great these days, but I want you to hear this song. This is how it goes. School days, little golden rule days, reading and writing and arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick. Bizarre. Okay? And the older I would get, I would change the lyrics. So this is in my mind. I just had an image. My mom is listening right now online. And she would come in, my dad, and sing. And my dad was a horrible singer. And they would sing, reading and writing and arithmetic. And in my head, I would, this is what would go off. This is the song that makes me sick. But we would do that every year. And I mean, it's weird to think that like school is like a week away, right? I mean, we're going back into this deal. And I was thinking, how many of you, we'd get to school and you had your favorite subjects? So I want to ask, in fact, how many of you would say my favorite subject was history? Okay. How many would say science was my favorite thing? Okay. You're the kids we all hated. Okay. How many of you would say PE? PE. Come on, I gave you an out. If you didn't like school, that was your out. How many of you would say English was my thing? Okay, in fact, because you're raising your hand, I'm going to quiz you right now. All right, so I'm going to throw a little word up here. So into, what kind of word is that? Very good. All right, let's go to the next one. Awkwardly is what? I have to tell you, you guys are smarter than the 9 o'clock service. Don't tell them, but just between us. Okay, so, and is what? How many remember this? Conjunction, junction. Boom. All right. Awesome. And then worship, because you're in church. Now think about this for your answer. Worship is what? It's a verb, people. Come on. It's a verb. You guys are good. I think we have one more, don't we? There we go. Outstanding is what? Wow. I'm seriously impressed. Like the dumb people come to 9 o'clock, okay? Wow. Okay. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Now, how many of you would say math is my thing? Awesome. You see the math people? Just to make sure, I want you to solve this right there. Go. Great. No. All right. Put that down. That scares the heck out of me. I had a friend of mine who said, he said, my son is taking right now, there's an actual course, he's taking theoretical math. He said, have you ever heard of that? I said, I took it. He said, Pastor, you took theoretical math. I said, yep, every time we had a math test, I was making crud up all the time. Theory, it's like whatever, I don't know. Okay, but we're going to start this series off, and we're going to talk about this math equation. What? Okay. And in a lot of circles outside of this space, who knows like what that means, right? Like what is that? But we're going to have a conversation about this because this mathematical equation, and if those of you who remember what an equation is, I want to tell you this. An equation is a statement of an equality containing one or more variables. And in the case of this number, all of which equally coexist as one, we're going to talk about the Trinity. So you and I, when we come in here and we worship, this is what I want everybody to know in this room. Christian theology says we worship a God who equally coexists, one God, 3 persons, 3 distinct personalities. And this is something that all of Christian theology supports. And it's mysterious to us. In fact, Augustine, who was one of the great philosophers and theologians, I think, in the 3rd century. We always think about him. He was one of the early church fathers. He said to try to explain, he said to not acknowledge the Trinity is to lose your soul. To try to explain the Trinity is to lose your mind. Okay? The word even that we use now today, we talk about the word Trinity, was a word that the church father Tertullian in the 4th century was the first one to ever use that term. You won't find the term in the Bible, but you'll find the essence of what that term is seeking to convey everywhere. And I believe with all of my heart that there is such tremendous power around a greater understanding of how this God has chosen to reveal himself in human history. One God, 3 distinct personalities. I want us to look at a passage of Scripture that I think has a lot of relevance for us. And again, it comes from the pen of the Apostle Paul. And for those of you who are new to church, maybe you're new here, you just stopped by, you don't know why you're here, you're here, you're at an invitation of someone. Paul was a man who had a radical transformation of his life and became a follower of Jesus. Lived like a century, lived in the generation just of Jesus, just outside of Jesus' generation. And just had a tremendous experience of Christ on the Damascus Road. He was at one time referred to as Saul of Tarsus. He was remembered as the chief persecutor of the Christian experience. For those who were early followers of Christ, they would refer to themselves as, listen to this, pilgrims on the way. Where Jesus said this, we remember this, Jesus said, I am what? The way, the truth, the life. He referred, we looked at it a few weeks ago, if you were here, where Jesus said, I am the gate for the sheep. I'm the way that the sheep find safe pasture. He defined himself by these terms. And so Saul was this instigator of the Christian religion. And then one time on his way to bring persecution to bear on early followers of Christ, he was taking a walk down this dirt road called the Damascus Road to go bring persecution to the church. And the Spirit of Jesus called out to him. And he had a radical conversion experience. Maybe you've known somebody like that whose life has been transformed by Jesus. I pray that that's many of us in this space this morning. And so he became better known in the New Testament as not Saul of Tarsus any longer. He became Paul, the apostle of Christ. And when Paul was writing about his experience, he would often go into these little places and he would just gather people together, and that's how they started a church back then. I think about starting our church in our living room, and we have folks who are here in this service right now who were here at that very service so many, many years ago. And when Paul would bring people together, and he would speak to them, oftentimes after he'd been there, he would go off and he would write, and somebody would take the letter back and read it. And maybe I've said this before, but they would take a letter. So a lot of the books we have in the Bible are letters that were written oftentimes in the New Testament by Paul. Somebody would go and they would just kind of stand up and make a proclamation. They would read this letter. So Paul is talking, and I want you to get in these first 6 verses what Paul says here. It's in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. He says, as a prisoner for the Lord, Paul was always in prison, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. For there is one body and one Spirit. Just as you were called to one hope when you were called, there's one Lord, there's one faith, there's one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Now, I want you to think with me for a moment. We're going to put our thinking caps on. So Paul, scholars believe when he wrote this letter, he'd been in prison in Rome. The last time he'd visited the Ephesian churches, it had been about 10 years. And he wrote this letter and he sent it back to these churches. Somebody stood up and read this letter. And Paul is talking to, watch this, not seasoned veterans in the Christian experience, beginners. Many of us in this room, beginners. And he says some interesting things I want to draw your attention to. He says, as a prisoner for the Lord, and he didn't mean that like, because I'm in jail, even though he was in jail. What he was really trying to convey is this: as someone who willfully accepts the divine assignment that God has given to me, I'm a prisoner to it, a captive. Okay? He said, as a captive, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes when you hear the word calling in church, we always think about it's only the preacher that has a specific calling. He's talking not to seasoned vets, he's talking to beginners, and this is what he's saying. All of us have this calling to live life in a way that brings God honor. Someone say amen. This is our calling. When you leave here, go live your calling. Go live a life that would bring God honor. And then notice what he says. This is how he says we do it. He says, be completely humble and gentle. I want to pause there. How you doing with that one? Okay? He says, be patient. How you doing with that one? Some of you might say, how you doing with that one? Mind your own business, okay? Bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep unity of the Spirit, capital S there, underlined in my Bible, through the bond of peace. And then he says this, watch, because here we go. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope. Lots of hopes out there. This is the only hope that matters. When you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Now, here's what I want to draw your attention to. He's talking about the Trinity. Do you notice there? One Father, one Lord, one Spirit, one God, three, bless you, three personalities. This is important for us. And this is really important, and I want to unearth something this morning. And a lot of times when we're doing series work, what Pastor Trevor and I really want to do in this is we try to lock onto a concept, an idea revealed in Holy Scripture. And then what we really want you to do is we want you to think about this in all these different ways. So this is our theme verse for this series. And so we would ask you to commend this to memory or be thinking about this, because this is like really, really important stuff. What God is saying here is that one of the most amazing things about our God is the Trinity and the way that God has chosen to reveal himself to us, and yet it is so oftentimes misunderstood. And the whole idea that we're trying to get around this idea where we say 3 equals 1 simply means this: 3 persons, 1 God. Say it with me. 3 persons, 1 God. Say it again. 3 persons, 1 God. It's sort of like this is what I want you to think about. If I asked you today when you greet me in the lobby, who are you? You would not say, hi, I'm a human. If you did that, we'd call the security team and carry you out. I mean, that's just a little bizarre. That's a little weird. We wouldn't say that. What you would say, if your name was Dale, you would say, hi, I'm Dale. What's your name? Because what we are is human. Who we are is our person. And in the same way, what I want us to get around this idea for just a moment is this. This is the same thing with God. What God is 1 God. But who God is represented in 3 distinct persons. And this is important. Because when we begin to get our minds and hearts around this, we begin to see an incredibly important truth come into view. And here's the truth. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. This is the first thing I want us to get. God doesn't just live in community. God is community. One of the things that Christian theology has taught us down through the ages is that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit mutually coexist as one entity. And I'm going to help us understand as we begin to lay some track this morning why it is actually that this is important to know. Some of you might be here right now and you're going, that's really cool, that's awesome. I'm not sure I care. I want to help you care and I want to help you understand, because here's what I want to say. Every single thing we might ever understand, every single thing we might ever aspire to understand, every single thing we ever would believe about how community or relationships work comes to us from a God who in his very divine nature, watch this, is community. This is powerful. You and I live in a world right now that is so divided. You and I live in a world right now where there has never been, I believe, quite this amount of isolation and aloneness in the midst of this sea of feverish activity that is going on around us all the time. We got all this stuff. We are so instantaneously connected on so many different levels at the same time, and we have never been so lonely. Sociologists right now are trying to figure out why are there such increased levels of suicide going on in our culture. This is at the bottom of it. I will tell you, it is at the bottom of it. Because we are just a culture that is alone. And so what I want to do is I want to hold up against that truth and that idea about our culture with the truth that you and I are in here this morning. We are worshiping a God who in his very divine nature is community. And that should say something to us. I remember a very telling moment in Jesus' life and in Jesus' ministry where he had now come to the place, follow me for a moment, where he had fully revealed himself to his disciples. If you read the Gospels, you notice he kind of puts it out in little pieces. It's almost like a puzzle. And there comes this moment really after the transfiguration where he reveals to them, he says this, and hey, by the way, everybody, I know this is really cool. They're like on the mountain and they're going, Lord, why don't we grill out? Why don't we just stay here? Why don't we send someone for snacks and just park here for a while? And he goes, oh, by the way, I'm going down the mountain, everybody. We're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to die on a Roman cross. That's an ultimate party killer right there. And so they go down the mountain and all of this stuff begins to break. And then he has this final moment with them in the upper room. Like, scholars think maybe 2/3 of the Gospel of John in the upper room. And so he's in the upper room and he's talking to them. And he says an interesting thing. I want you to see it. He says, I'm going to go away and watch. He says, you're not going to see me right before this. He says, you won't see me for a while. And then he says this weird thing. I'm going to ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever. The Spirit of truth. Now, the world can't accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him. What he's basically saying there is, even back then, we live in a world where only what we see is we think that's all there is. And if you were here last weekend, we said, all that we see is not all there is, right? And then he goes on and he says, but you know him, for he lives with you. And he will be in you. Now, I want us all to do, Michael J. Fox, and do a Back to the Future for a moment. And I want us to go back and you pretend you're in the upper room. And he just laid this down. Can you just imagine? And they're going, oh, like, woo. Time out, Jesus. What? Wait a minute, you're going, where are you going? And it's like it all comes to bear. But I want you to notice the interplay of what he's saying. I will ask who? The Father. And he will send what? The Spirit. And you will be okay. This is one of the greatest truths of the Christian experience. You're not in here just worshiping a God who is in a building. I remember the early days of our church, and I was talking to a guy one time, and he had that awkward moment in the conversation where you go, what do you do? What do you do? And he said, so what do you do? And I thought, oh, here it comes. And I said, I'm a preacher. He said, it's always like a thud. You're a preacher. And this is in the early days of our church. He said, I don't do organized religion. And I thought right away, I came back to him, I said, you should come to our church. We practice disorganized religion. He didn't come, but I thought he'd like it. Okay? And then he made this comment. He goes, I can't come to church like, if I came to church like the building would fall down. People say that, but here, they always think God's in the building. Hey, let me remind everybody, you're the building. He lives in you. This is a powerful thing. I want you to understand everything you need to know about relationships and about community and about how all that stuff works finds its beginning place in a God who doesn't just exist in community. He is community. And let me tell you why this is important. It's important because we are made in God's image, which means then we are made for community. When I was growing up, one of my favorite things to do was to work alongside of my father. And we would go, back in the day here, I mentioned Woolworths and the department store. Back then they didn't have Home Depot. They had a store called Lindsay's. How many of y'all remember Lindsay's? Okay, all right. And I used to love it when my dad would get up on Saturday, and that was his day off, and he'd go, I'm going to Lindsay's. And he would, and who wants to go? I would always be like, I go, because I knew he would stop and get me a donut. Wow. So I'm like, I'm in. We're gonna get a donut. I'm gonna be with you. And we would go, and we would do these home repair projects, and my dad liked to work with wood. And he wasn't really, I'm just gonna say it, God bless him, he wasn't real great at it, but he slugged away at it. And I developed an affinity for that. I like to do that. And there is a phrase for those of us who like to mess around with that stuff, that you always have to know when you're working with wood, whether you're making cuts with the grain or against the grain. Some of you are shaking your head because you know this. See, here's what I want everybody to know. You have been created. You have the DNA of the living God in your soul. And so the living God who has placed his DNA in your soul is that DNA has as part of its nature the idea, the challenge that we would live in community together. That we would refuse the temptation, the gravitational pull in our culture to live life alone. Some of you are here right now, and if truth be told, you were to share your heart, you would say, I am so lonely. And what I would tell you, if we were to do church right, you would not say that. Nobody who came to Community of Hope would ever say that. And when we live lives alone, we're cutting against the grain of how we've been created. Now, I love to work with wood, and right now, if I'm not working with wood, I'm working on wedding stuff. Pray for me about that. This week, I got a text from a dear friend of mine. I want to show you a picture. That's wedding one. Wedding number 2 is coming. And this is a group of guys that I have been in a deep relationship with now for 28 years. They're all pastors, 28 years. It's obvious that the years have been better to me than the rest of the group. They're listening, so I wanted to throw that in. I won't tell you who, but I got a text from one of them this week, and he sent a picture of our group. And this is what he said. It is not an underestimation or an exaggeration, he texted all of us to say, I would likely not be married or in the ministry were it not for the fellowship of this group. Boom. Now, I don't share that with you to brag, but I do want to create some tension in the room. Who do you call when you feel that way? See, this is a time of year right now. Every year when school starts, we just made a commitment years ago. When school starts, we're going to talk about doing life not in rows, but in circles. In fact, that's what we say every year. Circles are better than what? Rows. They're better. And we're all going to find in our lives places when we're alone, places when we're misunderstood, places when life is not fair. Life is not fair, everybody. And we need to be reminded of that, and we need a support group around us. And watch this, when you choose to be in a support group, you are coming into alignment with the way God has created. So if it feels weird for you to be alone, it should. You weren't created that way. I find that true when Jesus told us about his sacrifice. And in fact, Paul was later talking about this sacrifice. And notice even how Paul writes it. Because there's one loaf, he says, we who are many are one body. Here we are. One body, for we all share in one loaf. The Bible says on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples and he said, take and eat. This is my body which is given for you. And he told all the disciples there in the upper room, do it in remembrance of me. Remember what I'm doing here. The Bible says after supper, he took a common cup and he gave thanks to the Father, and then he turned to the disciples and he said, drink from this cup. This cup will represent, said a very strange thing, my blood, which will be shed for you. And in that culture, they were familiar with sacrifices and blood and offerings and all of that. And Jesus was in this moment saying, you don't need to do that anymore after I'm here. I'm going to be the one sacrifice for you. And he was. Which brings us to this moment. So I just want to ask one thing. We participate in open communion table, which means if you invite Jesus and Jesus alone to forgive your sins, we invite you to the table. If it's any part of your desire to live a life that brings God honor, you're welcome to the table. If you want to live, and then we say this, in good community with other people, to be kind, to be loving, to be generous, to be fair. Jesus says, you're welcome, come. But I want to give you a challenge as you come this morning. Ask the Lord through his Spirit who lives within people who have called on his name to help you live in greater community with people who are following him. This is what you need. Maybe it's even why you're here today. God, will you bless all of my friends as we now remember the sacrifice you have made? Give us a moment to take just a space here and say, Lord, point out things that are not in alignment and keeping with who we profess we are, and do your work in us so, God, we might come to you in full humility, full recognition as you being the only one to forgive sins and to heal hearts and lives. Do it in this space as we receive from communion. And we thank you for every single good thing that we find in the name of Christ. And everyone said, amen.